right, welcome to the deep dive. You guys have sent in like a ton of stuff on climate change this time. So today we're gonna take a deep dive into all of that. We're gonna try to pull out what's really important, what you really need to know, what's going on, why does it matter, and what can we do about it.
Yeah, we've got a whole mix of sources here. We got scientific reports, articles, data, all kinds of stuff, and it gives us, a really good overall view of the issue. We'll be diving into the definition of climate change, what impacts we're already seeing, what causes it, natural and human causes. Then we'll look at what could happen in the future, and importantly, how we can address it, reducing emissions, adapting to the changes that are already locked in. We'll also talk about policy and how the public sees it all.
And to, really hit home how urgent this all is. Get this. 2024 was the hottest year on record. Yeah, no joke. We hit a crazy plus 1.60 degrees Celsius. That's 2.88 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. That's our baseline, going back to 1850 when we started keeping good global records. Okay, so that's a real temperature spike. So let's start with the basics. What do we even mean when we say climate change?
That's the million-dollar question, right? People use global warming and climate change kind of like they mean the same thing. And that was pretty common before the 2000s especially. Global warming became a popular term after 1988. But there's a subtle difference. Technically, global warming really means the increase in Earth's average surface temperature. Climate change is the broader term. It includes the warming, but also all the other effects on the whole climate system, like changes in rainfall. It's kind of like, global warming is the fever, and climate change is all the symptoms that come with it.
So climate change is like the big umbrella term. I've noticed people are using terms like climate crisis, climate emergency, even global heating. Do those just mean the same thing? Or do they have a different meaning?
You're right. Those terms are getting a lot of attention, especially when people are just talking about it. They really want to stress how urgent this is, how serious it could get. Global heating, well, that's pretty straightforward, right? It means the temperature is going up. Then you have climate crisis and climate emergency. They kind of frame it as something that needs immediate action, big response. While they might sound more urgent, they're basically talking about the same core issue, those big changes to the planet's climate system.
Got it. It's about how we're talking about it, how serious it is. So let's zoom out for a second. Our sources talk about the history of Earth's climate. It's not like it's always been the same, right?
Oh, definitely not. Earth's climate, it's always been changing. Over millions of years, we've gone through ice ages, those glacial periods, and then warmer interglacial periods, like way back, about 125,000 years ago. During the last interglacial period, the planet was actually, get this, 0.5 to 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than before humans started messing things up. Sea levels were a lot higher too, like 5 to 10 meters higher than today. Fast forward to the most recent glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago. Now it was way colder, 5 to 7 degrees Celsius colder, and sea levels were crazy low, over 125 meters lower. It's wild, right? Those are some massive shifts caused by natural things over a long, long time.
Those are some huge swings, hard to imagine. But our sources talk about a period of, stability more recently, right?
Yeah, so the interglacial period we're in right now, it started about 11,700 years ago. And the crazy thing is, global temperatures stabilized. That's really important because that's when, human civilization really got going and we started farming. Compared to those massive changes we talked about, the climate's been pretty consistent during this time when humans have been developing. And that's important because, the recent warming and cooling trends, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, they didn't happen everywhere on the planet at the same time. But the overall stability since we started farming is a stark contrast to the rapid changes we're seeing now.
Okay, so the climate naturally goes up and down, but then we had this period of stability that's now being messed up, really fast. And that brings us to the impacts we're already seeing. What kind of environmental changes are we seeing right now?
Sadly, the impacts are becoming more and more obvious, and they're everywhere. We're seeing deserts getting bigger, heat waves and wildfires. They're happening more often. They're more intense. The Arctic is warming super fast, way faster than the rest of the planet. And that's causing permafrost to thaw, glaciers to shrink, and a lot less sea ice. Plus, we're seeing more intense storms, droughts that are worse, and other extreme weather is just more common now.
I remember reading that the Arctic warming is Like almost 4 times the global average rate since 1979. What does that mean? Why is that so bad?
Yeah, you're right. The Arctic is warming really fast, and that has all sorts of knock-on effects. A big worry is that the thawing permafrost releases methane, a really potent greenhouse gas, and that makes the warming even worse. It's a vicious cycle. Then there's the loss of sea ice, which is really bad for the Arctic ecosystem, and it adds to the rising sea levels, although melting ice on land is a bigger factor there.
So it's like a domino effect, making the problem worse.
Yep.
What other environmental changes are, really standing out?
Well, these sensitive ecosystems like mountains, coral reefs, and again, the Arctic, they're changing so fast that it's really hard for species to keep up. A lot of them are having to move to find the right conditions, and some, well, they just can't adapt fast enough and might go extinct. What's really scary is that even if we cut way back on future warming, some effects are already baked in. Like the oceans getting hotter, more acidic, and sea levels rising. That stuff's going to keep happening for centuries.
That's pretty hard to hear, that even if we do something, there are some consequences that are here to stay. What are some real-world examples of these impacts that are already affecting things?
Well, think about all those huge wildfires we've seen all over the world. They're getting worse because of the heat and the droughts. They're bigger, harder to control, and more destructive. Coral reefs are getting hit hard too, with more frequent and severe bleaching events. It's like underwater heat waves that stress the coral, and it can even kill it off. And of course, the droughts are getting worse in many places, and that's a direct threat to our water supplies for drinking, for farming, for everything. A lot of these impacts have really become clear in the last, I'd say, 20 years or so.
Yeah, it feels like we're watching it happen. Let's talk about the temperature stuff more closely. The sources talk about a consistent upward trend in global surface temperatures. What's the big deal with that?
Right. The data shows a clear and steady increase in global surface temperatures, especially since the mid-1800s when we started getting good measurements with instruments. The scary thing is that in recent decades, new high-temperature records aren't just breaking the old ones by a little, they're smashing them by more and more. And that's happening over a larger area of the planet. And it's not just the air temperature, the oceans are soaking up a ton of heat too. Over 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases ends up in the oceans. That's causing the ocean temperatures to rise, and that's bad news for sea life, and it makes sea levels go up.
I remember a while back there was this talk of a global warming hiatus. Whatever happened to that? Does it mean temperatures aren't rising anymore?
Good point. There was a time, not that long ago, when the rate of warming at the surface seemed to slow down. People started talking about a global warming hiatus, but scientists figured out that it was mostly natural variations in the climate that were temporarily masking the long-term warming trend. The heat was going into the deeper parts of the ocean during that time. But since then, warming has kicked up again, and it's even sped up, and that's why 2024 was so much hotter than the average, even briefly going over 1.5 degrees Celsius. It shows how natural fluctuations can happen within a long-term trend, which is why it's better to look at temperature changes over longer periods, like 20 years, to smooth out the short-term ups and downs and see the bigger picture.
So the trend is still up, up, up. Besides the surface temperatures, what else tells us the planet's getting warmer?
There's actually a lot of other evidence. For example, while the lower part of the atmosphere where we live is getting warmer, the upper atmosphere is actually cooling down. That pattern of temperature change, up and down, is exactly what you'd expect with more greenhouse gases trapping heat closer to the surface. We're also seeing less snow cover, glaciers are shrinking all over the world, and the oceans are evaporating more, making the air more humid and leading to more rain in a lot of places. Even plants and animals are reacting. Plants are flowering earlier in the year, and animals are moving towards the poles or higher up mountains to find cooler places to live. It's like the whole planet is responding.
It really does sound like the planet's changing in big ways. Is the warming happening at the same rate everywhere?
No, not really. Greenhouse gases mix all over the atmosphere, but the effects are different in different places. Land areas are warming about twice as fast as the global average. And, as we already talked about, the Arctic is warming much faster than the global average. There are a lot of reasons for these regional differences, including how much heat land and water can hold. Land heats up and cools down faster than water.
So what's next? What are the experts saying about the future? I know groups like the IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization make these projections. What do you think is the most important stuff to take away from those?
The projections are a little scary and show just how urgent it is to act. The World Meteorological Organization recently said there's almost a 50% chance that the average global temperature for at least 1 year in the next 5 will go over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's just temporarily exceeding it, mind you. The IPCC, in their latest assessment, said that they think the 20-year average global temperature will go over this 1.5 degree limit in the early 2030s for most emission scenarios. In 2021, they had a report where they laid out different future scenarios based on how much greenhouse gas we emit. Even in a scenario with very low emissions, warming is still projected to reach 1.0 to 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2100. In a middle-of-the-road scenario, it's 2.1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius, and in a really high-emission scenario, we could see a potentially catastrophic 3.3 to 5.7 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. These aren't just numbers, they represent vastly different futures.
Those high-end scenarios sound really bad, and the warming doesn't just stop in 2100, right?
That's right. In those scenarios where emissions stay high or even medium, the warming will continue past 2100 for centuries. That's because carbon dioxide hangs around in the atmosphere for a long time, and some parts of the climate system, like the deep oceans and big ice sheets, take a really long time to respond. Some projections, looking way out to 2300, suggest that under high emissions, temperatures could get to levels that haven't been seen for millions of years, back when Earth's climate was totally different, with much higher sea levels and everything.
That puts things into perspective. Our sources also talk about this carbon budget. What is that, and how does it help us understand where we're headed?
The carbon budget is super important. It's basically how much more carbon dioxide we can emit into the atmosphere before we blow past those temperature targets, like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. UNEP estimates that to have a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, our remaining carbon budget after 2023 is only around 200 gigatons of CO2. To give you an idea, global emissions are currently around 40 to 50 gigatons of CO2 every year. So we'd use up that budget in about 4 years if we keep going like this. If we aim for a 2.0 degree target, the budget is bigger, about 900 gigatons, but that still only gives us about 16 years at our current rate. It really shows how little time we have to make big changes and cut emissions if we want to meet these targets.
It's like we're on a tie allowance for how much more carbon we can emit. Finally, on this temperature stuff, our sources briefly mentioned natural climate cycles. Do those play a role in the rapid warming we're seeing now, and how do they affect the projections?
Yeah, Earth's climate system does have all sorts of natural cycles that work over different timescales, from years to decades to even centuries. Things like El Niño and La Niña, for example, those can cause big short-term changes in global temperatures and weather patterns. So these natural things can cause temperatures to go up and down for a bit, but the main point is that all the scientists agree that the really fast and big warming we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, that can't be explained by just natural cycles. The amount of warming and how fast it's happening, that's way outside what we've seen naturally in the past. It's really clear that human activities are the main cause. Climate models that only include natural things, they just can't reproduce the warming we've seen. They only work when you include emissions caused by humans.
So the science is clear. Human activities, mainly emitting greenhouse gases, are driving this warming. Let's move on to climate change feedbacks.
Yeah.
What are those? How do they affect how much the planet warms?
Climate change feedbacks are basically processes in Earth's climate system that react to a change in temperature. It could be warming or cooling, and these feedbacks can either make the change bigger, a positive feedback, or smaller, a negative feedback. These feedbacks are super important for understanding how much climate change we'll actually experience, because they can make the warming from our greenhouse gas emissions a lot bigger, or in some cases, a little smaller.
Can you give us some examples of these positive feedback loops, the ones that make the warming worse?
Sure. One of the biggest ones is the water vapor feedback. When the atmosphere warms up because of those extra greenhouse gases, it can hold more moisture, more water vapor, and water vapor itself is a greenhouse gas. So this extra moisture traps even more heat, making the warming even worse, like a snowball effect. Then you have the ice albedo feedback. Bright surfaces like snow and ice, they reflect a lot of sunlight back into space. But when temperatures rise, the snow and ice melt, exposing darker surfaces underneath, like land or water, and those absorb more sunlight, making things even warmer, leading to more melting. It's a big reason why the Arctic is warming so fast. Changes in clouds are complicated, but overall, it's thought that the way clouds will change in a warmer world will likely make the warming worse, not better.
Are there any negative feedbacks, the kind that might slow down the warming?
Yeah, there's one main one called radiative cooling. As Earth's surface temperature goes up, it radiates more heat back into space. This extra heat loss kind of offsets some of the warming from greenhouse gases. But those positive feedbacks we talked about, especially water vapor and ice albedo, they're generally thought to be stronger than this negative feedback. That's why the planet's still warming. There are also feedbacks within the carbon cycle, like higher CO2 levels can make some plants grow faster, leading to them taking up more CO2 from the atmosphere. But there's a limit to how much these natural carbon sinks can absorb, and as temperatures keep rising, they might even weaken.
So it sounds like these feedback loops are really important for figuring out how much warming we'll actually get. Let's talk about how scientists actually project what future climate change might look like. That's where climate models come in, right?
Exactly. Climate models are basically really complex computer programs that simulate how the atmosphere, oceans, land, ice, and all the living things interact to make Earth's climate. They use basic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, and they include both natural things like changes in the sun's energy or volcanic eruptions and things caused by humans, especially greenhouse gas and aerosol emissions.
So they're like trying to create a mini Earth in a computer. That sounds incredibly complicated. How much can we trust these models?
It is super complex, but climate models have gotten way more sophisticated and accurate over time as our understanding of the climate has improved and computers have become more powerful. They use math equations to simulate things like how air circulates in the atmosphere, ocean currents, how energy and moisture move between different parts of the climate system, and even how carbon moves around the planet. Climate models aren't just theoretical, they're tested by seeing how well they can recreate what we've already observed about the climate in the past. And they do a pretty good job of matching large-scale temperature changes, as well as other things like ocean circulation, seasons, and even general rainfall patterns. They're not perfect, they have limitations, but they're a really valuable tool for projecting possible future climate scenarios based on different assumptions about what humans will do, especially how much greenhouse gas will emit.
So while they're complex, they're based on good science, and they've been pretty good at matching past climate changes, so we can be somewhat confident in their projections. Let's talk about the real-world impacts. We touched on some environmental effects earlier, but let's dive a bit deeper into what we're seeing now and what we expect to see in the future.
Yeah, the environmental effects of climate change are wide-ranging, and we're seeing them pretty much everywhere now. Droughts and heat waves are happening more often at the same time in many regions, and that's really bad news for farming, water resources, and human health. In monsoon regions like India and East Asia, we're seeing bigger swings between really wet and really dry periods during the monsoon seasons. And overall, there's been more rain during the monsoons in the Northern Hemisphere since around 1980.
What about big storms like hurricanes and typhoons? Is climate change affecting those?
Scientists are still figuring out all the details, but it looks like as the oceans get warmer, which gives these storms more energy, and as the air gets more humid, hurricanes and typhoons are likely to dump more rain, and they might even get more intense. There's some evidence that they might also start happening in areas that aren't used to them, as their range shifts towards the poles. But it's important to note that the total number of these storms around the world hasn't really shown a clear increasing trend because of climate change so far.
Sea level rise is another big worry for a lot of coastal areas. What's the latest on that?
Global sea level is rising, and it's mainly because of two things. Warmer water expands and takes up more space, and glaciers and ice sheets on land are melting, adding more water to the oceans. The rate of sea level rise has actually been speeding up in recent decades. It's now about 4.8 centimeters per decade, on average, between 2014 and 2023. The IPCC projects a wide range of possible sea level rise over this century, depending on how much greenhouse gas we emit. If we keep emitting a lot, we could see a lot more sea level rise by 2100. And there's growing concern that the big ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica could become unstable and melt a lot faster, which could add meters to sea levels over a longer time. Some recent studies even say that under very high emissions, sea levels could go up as much as 2 meters by 2100.
Wow, 2 meters. That would be devastating for a lot of coastal communities and low-lying islands. What about the polar regions? We talked about the Arctic warming really fast. What other changes are happening there?
The Arctic sea ice has been shrinking and getting thinner for decades, and it's speeding up. The amount of sea ice has gone down dramatically, especially in the summer. Even with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, summers with no ice are projected to be rare. But if we hit 2 degrees of warming, they'll be a lot more common, happening maybe every 3 to 10 years. This loss of sea ice is really bad for the Arctic ecosystem, and it adds to the warming through that ice albedo feedback we talked about. The oceans are changing too. As more CO2 goes into the atmosphere, some of it dissolves into the ocean, making it more acidic. This ocean acidification makes it harder for marine animals like shellfish and corals to build their shells and skeletons. Warmer water also holds less oxygen, so oxygen levels in the ocean are going down, and we're seeing more dead zones in coastal areas where there's not enough oxygen for marine life.
It's amazing how all these parts of the Earth's system are connected. Our sources also mention climate tipping points. What are those and why should we be worried about them?
Climate tipping points are like critical thresholds in the climate system. If we cross them, it could trigger these big, sudden, and possibly irreversible changes, even if global temperatures later stabilized or even went down a bit. It's kind of like a domino effect. Once one falls, it can set off a chain reaction. Some examples are things like the Greenland ice sheet melting completely, which would raise sea levels by several meters, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, which is this big ocean current that's really important for regulating regional climates that could weaken or even stop, and tropical rainforests, like the Amazon, could die off, releasing a ton of stored carbon into the atmosphere and changing regional weather patterns. Coral reefs are also really close to a tipping point in many places because of warming and acidification. They could get so damaged that they might not recover. The scary thing about tipping points is that they could cause these huge and sudden shifts in the climate with really bad and long-lasting consequences. And once we cross them, it might be really hard or even impossible to go back.
The changes in the oceans, especially, sound really serious, like they might not be reversible.
Yeah, they are. Over the long haul, meaning hundreds or even thousands of years, the oceans will keep warming, the remaining ice sheets and glaciers will keep melting, and sea levels will keep rising because these are really big, slow-moving systems. Sea level is projected to rise about 2.3 meters for every degree Celsius of warming over a 2,000-year period. Ocean acidification will also stick around for a really long time, hundreds to thousands of years, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for so long and the oceans mix really slowly. Even the deep ocean is projected to lose more than 10% of its oxygen because of the warming that's already happened. And it looks like the West Antarctic ice sheet is already on track to melt almost completely, no matter what we do. That could add at least 3.3 meters to global sea levels over the next 2,000 years. These are changes that will reshape coastlines and ocean ecosystems for a really, really long time.
It's hard to wrap your head around those kinds of changes and how long they'll last. What about ecosystems on land and the plants and animals that live there?
We're already seeing big changes in those ecosystems too. A lot of plants and animals are shifting where they live, moving towards the poles or higher up mountains, trying to find places with the right climate. For example, studies have shown that lots of birds, insects, and mammals are expanding their ranges towards the poles. In some areas, higher CO2 levels and longer growing seasons have actually caused some ecosystems to become greener, with plants growing more. But in other places, the extra heat and more frequent droughts are causing plants to die off, even whole forests. It's still unclear what the overall effect will be, and it varies from place to place. We're also seeing deserts expanding in some areas. With global warming happening so fast, it's more likely that ecosystems will change really suddenly and dramatically. And many scientists think we'll see a lot of biodiversity loss and extinctions because many species just won't be able to adapt or move fast enough to keep up with the changes in climate. Interestingly, marine species are actually moving towards the poles faster on average than land species. Marine heat waves are becoming more common and intense, and that's really hurting a lot of marine life, like corals, kelp forests, and seabirds. Ocean acidification is making it harder for things like shellfish and corals to build their shells, and we're seeing more harmful algal blooms in coastal waters, which can deplete oxygen and disrupt food webs.
Can you give us some specific examples of what these changes look like?
Sure. In the Arctic, as the permafrost thaws, it's not just releasing those greenhouse gases, it's also making the ground unstable, which can cause buildings, roads, and pipelines to collapse, since they were built on what used to be solid frozen ground. A lot of those iconic Arctic animals, like polar bears and some seals, they depend on sea ice for hunting, breeding, and raising their young, but their habitat is disappearing as the ice melts earlier in the spring and freezes later in the fall. In warmer areas, milder winters are letting some pests survive in bigger numbers, like pine beetles in western North America. These beetles can destroy forests.
It's clear that these environmental changes are having a big impact on both natural systems and the species that depend on them. Now let's talk about how climate change is directly affecting us, the human consequences.
The impacts of climate change are affecting people all over the world, but the sources you provided emphasize that low-latitude and less developed regions are facing the most serious and widespread impacts, the kind that could be irreversible. The risks are also not spread evenly within societies, with disadvantaged and marginalized people being more vulnerable because they often have fewer resources and less support to help them deal with climate shocks, like extreme weather events and crop failures.
Let's break down these human impacts a bit. Let's start with health and food security. How is climate change affecting those?
In terms of health, we're already seeing, and we expect to see more, heat-related deaths and illness, like heat stroke, especially in vulnerable people like the elderly and those with existing health problems. Changes in temperature and rainfall are also affecting the spread of diseases carried by insects and other animals, like malaria, dengue fever, and Lyme disease. So, more people might be at risk of getting these diseases. Climate change is also expected to make it harder to grow food in many parts of the world, especially in low-latitude areas that already struggle with food security. Things like more droughts, extreme heat that damages crops, and changes in the growing seasons will all make it harder to produce food. The World Economic Forum has projected that more droughts in vulnerable regions could lead to millions more deaths from malnutrition by 2050, and more kids will suffer from stunting, which means they don't grow properly. Livestock farming is also expected to decline globally as temperatures rise because there will be less feed for the animals and the heat will stress them. Some long-term projections suggest that if emissions keep rising unchecked, there could be over 9 million additional deaths every year by the end of the century because of climate change.
Those are scary numbers. It's a real threat to people's lives and well-being. What about the impacts on people's jobs, economic stability, and inequality?
Sadly, climate change will likely make existing inequalities worse, whether those are based on wealth, social status, or where you live. Marginalized people, who often have fewer resources and less political power, usually have a harder time dealing with climate-related disasters and recovering from them. Indigenous populations are particularly vulnerable because their cultures and livelihoods are often closely tied to their land and the ecosystems they depend on. While there's still debate about whether climate change directly causes armed conflict, it can make things worse by increasing competition for scarce resources like water and land, which could lead to more tension and instability. It's also important to remember that while women aren't inherently more vulnerable to climate change than men, in many societies they face discrimination and unequal access to resources, which can make it harder for them to adapt and cope with climate change. For example, in many agricultural communities, women might have to work much harder when there are climate stresses like heat waves or droughts.
And another big concern is climate migration. How is climate change affecting where people live and how they move?
Coastal communities and small island nations are facing a growing threat from rising sea levels and more frequent coastal flooding and storm surges. They're literally losing land, and some areas could become permanently uninhabitable. For some island nations, this is an existential threat because it could displace their entire population, and those people could become stateless. In some inland areas, it might eventually get so hot and humid that people won't be able to live there anymore, especially if they have to work outside. These changes in the environment can force people to move, both within their own country and to other countries. This is called climate or environmental migration. People are forced to leave their homes because of rising seas, extreme weather, and competition for resources that are becoming scarcer. But it's important to remember that not everyone who's affected by climate change will be able to move. Some people just don't have the means or the ability to migrate, even when their homes become unsafe.
So climate change is a big factor in displacement and instability all over the world. Let's shift gears and talk about what we can do about it. Mitigation, which means cutting greenhouse gas emissions, that's a crucial first step, right?
Absolutely. Mitigation is about reducing the amount of greenhouse gases we release into the atmosphere and also finding ways to remove carbon dioxide from the air. To have a good chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to get to net zero emissions globally by around 2050. If we aim for 2 degrees, we have a bit more time, until around 2070. But to reach those goals, we need to make big, fast changes across all parts of our societies and economies, including energy, how we use land, transportation, buildings, industry, you name it.
So what are the main strategies and technologies that can help us make those big cuts in emissions?
The most important thing is to stop using fossil fuels. That means coal, oil, and natural gas. We can do this by becoming more energy efficient, so we need less energy overall, and by switching to low-carbon and renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. Nuclear power can also be part of the mix in some cases, although it has its own pros and cons. Once we have clean electricity, we can use it to power other things, like transportation, by switching to electric vehicles, heating and cooling buildings with electric heat pumps, and even some industrial processes that currently use fossil fuels.
We hear a lot about carbon dioxide removal these days. How does that fit into the picture?
Carbon dioxide removal, CDR, that's about actively taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it permanently. There are natural ways to do this, like planting trees, reforestation, or planting new forests where there weren't any before, afforestation, and also improving how we manage agricultural soils to store more carbon. Then there are more technological approaches, like direct air capture, which uses chemical processes to pull CO2 straight out of the air, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, where you burn biomass for energy, but you capture the CO2 that's released and store it away. A lot of the models that show how we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees rely on using a lot of CDR in the second half of the century to offset emissions we can't get rid of and maybe even lower the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But we're still not sure about some things with CDR, like how much it will cost, how much energy it will need, and what the potential environmental impacts might be.
Let's talk a bit more about those low-carbon energy sources. What are some of the good and bad things about each one?
Solar and wind power have gotten a lot cheaper in recent years, so they're now competitive with fossil fuels in many places. And they don't emit much greenhouse gas when they're operating, which is a big plus. The challenge with solar and wind is that they're intermittent. They only work when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. So we need better ways to store energy, like batteries or pumped hydro, and we need smarter electricity grids. Hydropower is a proven low-carbon technology, but there aren't many places left where we can build new dams, especially in developed countries, and new large-scale projects can be controversial because they can harm river ecosystems and displace communities. Nuclear power is low-carbon and can provide a steady, reliable supply of electricity, but it's controversial because of concerns about nuclear waste disposal, the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation, and the potential for accidents, even though they are rare with modern reactor designs. Bioenergy, where you burn organic matter for fuel, can be low carbon if it's done sustainably, but we have to make sure it doesn't compete with food production or lead to deforestation. If it's not done right, it can be bad for the environment.
So it's not about picking one perfect solution. It's about using a mix of different low-carbon technologies. The sources also mention some other benefits of switching to clean energy. What are those?
Yeah, that's important. Switching to clean energy not only helps with climate change, but it's also good for our health and the economy. Burning less fossil